You're listening to WCAT Radio, your home for authentic Catholic programming.
Hello, everybody. Deacon Al Bielawski with another edition of Catholic Mysticism and Spirituality, where we talk about the mystical and supernatural aspects of our faith, topics that are Catholic, and things that are affecting us in our world and our Catholic faith today. So I hope you'll join us. We're going to do part 2 of our series here on God and the proof of his existence. I hope you tuned in last week and we went over some things, basically a quick recap about contingent beings. That is, we cannot cause our own existence. Henceforth, children cannot become their own father. So we need all things that exist. We need that creator in order to have existence, because what is, and that is our essence, for instance, does not mean that it is, but what it is. And I use an example, I think, of a mermaid. We know what it is, we know they don't exist, but, the essence of that we can talk about. But we also know, because these things don't exist, that it isn't. And yet when we talked about God, we talked about essence and what and that it is. So our existence is a that. It's not a what. We exist, and we know this. So we can see that there's a difference between this essence and existence. And for us to be existent, then, we are contingent upon a first cause. And we went over all that, and I don't want to throw you off with that. We also talked about some natural laws that are in effect that we have in the cosmos, that science, faith, and reason do not contradict each other, should not be at war with each other. And we talked about the limitations of science. Despite all the great stuff they do, they're still limited in things, especially when it comes to the supernatural and philosophical questions. So we talked all about that, and you can go back and check that out. And today we're going to talk about, rather than the argument of existence and the argument of contingency, we'll talk about that argument for design. And this is a tough one because it's kind of the most controversial. This is the one where many scientists do not want to talk about the first cause as being God for many, many reasons. And yet it's one of the best proofs for the existence of God. And we see that, it's a teleological argument. And we've got to keep that in mind. And what that, means is that teleology embodies the idea that nature has certain goals and ends. And what that means is that certain things have been designed for a purpose. Now, right away we can look at the eye and see that it's been, designed to see, the ear to hear, the heart for pumping, and the hand for grasping, and so on. I think you get the idea from that. Now, so we, however, as St. Thomas Aquinas said, whatever lacks knowledge cannot move toward an end unless it be directed by something being endowed with the knowledge and intelligence to move that end. And he likened it to an arrow that is directed by the archer. So basically what he was saying is that some intelligent being exists whom all natural things are directed to their end, and what Aquinas called that God. So, obviously we know St. Thomas was not a dummy, and he, based this because he was very well aware of things in the world, is where not just supernaturally, but certainly in the material world. So he knows this, and that what he said is that everything must be directed by some being endowed with knowledge and intelligence for anything, including a plant, to grow toward the light. And that's how we go and we see the teleological explanation for that. That even though plants they strive to the light on their own, They were designed for that. It's just like our heart, I mentioned earlier, is designed to pump, to keep us living. It's the same way when we design a pump to, say, used to bring water and process water, say, to a forest fire, that they have these pumps that they use, and they hook up with the hose and put them in a pond of water to draw water out to fight a forest fire. So these specific pumps are designed to do that, just like our heart is designed to pump blood and get that, heart moving. So we see this, and we come back, and of course, we look at some of the things from evolution on this. Now, if you're a listener to the show, I don't personally believe in evolution. I've seen in my, and it's a personal opinion, because of my work in outdoors, recreation outdoors, I've seen just so much intricacy and so much order in nature and the way things work together. We're going to talk about that too, because, that's actually a concept for the answer is God has designed. But for right now, we see that these things that are designed have goals and purposes. And the problem we have with evolution, and just for a minute, if you'll bear with me here, is that we look and see that natural selection, which Darwin talked about, didn't really discard the word from biology. And many people have misinterpreted that. And you see that when we look at this, we can see, as I mentioned, that heart being a pump has a design. The pump that we designed to fight forest fires has a design. And when evolutionary biologists speak about natural selection, what they're saying is that there is something that is selected that is fit or successful. And they are actually talking about a teleology based on the notion of design. Because we talked about this on last show. All causes have effects. Now, certain effects, we know, are more successful for survival than others. And that means then that some organisms are successful and effective in reaching whatever that goal is that they have. Because why? Because they have a design that enables that successful outcome. And if these features were not design-like, let's be quite honest here, they wouldn't work. They could not work. So natural selection really doesn't create the fit, but it selects what fits. So again, natural selection doesn't create the fit. It just selects what fits. And it does not explain a fit, but uses a fit in order to select. So when we look at this, we see that the fittest are not defined by their survival, but by their design. And that's important. That's important because it means that biological fitness, it's not an outcome of natural selection, but it's just a condition for natural selection. So basically we go back and we're looking at this argument then of a creator, of a first cause. Now, mechanisms we see are, some would argue, are a cause of this natural selection, right? We talked a moment ago, and we talked again in last week's show about certain causes and effects. But mechanisms can only work on a condition if there is a design in its nature. In other words, it has to be designed to make that mechanism responsible. So the mechanism, there has to be design for that. So again, we come and see that there is order in the way things are done. That even if it was a mechanism such as natural selection, the mechanism can only work on the condition that there is design in its nature. And that means that any process then is based, such as natural selection, on a design-like world. And this is, again, very important because it means that natural selection merely means that causes, again, have effects. and that some effects are better than others for survival. So really, the theory of evolution, Darwinism, doesn't take, that's where the misconception is, that it replaces the designer. It does not. Because even these mechanisms need to have a design in the condition that they have to have this in order for them to work. So, we see the problem in our modern world that, again, I mentioned that scientists and many people do not want to take that extra step and say, okay, that there is a creator, that there is a necessary being. They, a lot of them will fight tooth and nail for that. But we look at nature, and I mentioned this, that I said in my working experience, my recreation, you can see that nature all around, you can see God's handiwork because it's permeated with this design. And it doesn't matter whether it's the animate world or the inanimate world. Because when we speak about this, we're talking about patterns. And these patterns are called regularity. And again, it's the regularity of having causes and effects. And they're the same. They're like causes, and they have like effects. And this you can see throughout the natural world. And this is what Aquinas was saying. Things that they act for an end. And it is evident that from their acting always or nearly always the same way. So this points that, again, to this design. Because let's look at it this way. If there was no regularity in our universe, then it would be no sense at all to even have sciences. There'd be no sense to search for the laws in physics or chemistry or any of the life science. It's only because we know, right, that like causes produce like effects that we are able to explain and predict in science with that material world. So the laws of nature that science brings to light are many, many patterns of regularity that we see in the universe. And that's what you see in nature. If you spend time in it, you'll see this regularity. And this is true and comes before science for even science to get started. Without that regularity, again, science would just be chaotic, it would be irregular, and it wouldn't make any sense. So this is why we see this. This is a strong reason for this necessary being, or this first cause, which we call God. Because what regularity does, it creates this cosmic order. And we see these laws. And whether it's physics, whether it's chemistry, whether it's atomic physics, whether it's quantum electrodynamics, you see these empirical laws that have been found that lead to deeper and deeper laws and principles. And the more you look at this and the more you examine it and the more you ponder this, the more you'll see that they are these deep, deep levels. You see that there's more order in nature, and it's more subtle, and it's intricate in all its designs. So for that to happen as mere chance, you can say that's really pushing it. And again, this seems to be for some scientists. I mentioned last week that there are a number of young scientists now, and the percentage is changing. It's in the positive, where they believe in God. That also is true in the medical field, by the way, with the younger people coming into the medical field. And it seems that, they feel threatened by this. Because, it seems like, okay, now maybe we've got some, suspicion in science, and that we need to avoid this because it won't be, it won't be as concise. It won't be as neutral as we think if we start using the term design. And you see, science in itself does not have that kind of power. We talked about that last week, that, it's beyond their realm. And that's important for us to hold on to, because, we saw this with all the work they did with the pandemic, and some of it was, really something, the way they got these vaccines and so fast, and it saved lives. But, too, on the other hand, we were told to follow the science, And in many cases, science was wrong, the science was wrong, the science was wrong, as it has been, and we pointed this out on last week's show, in several cases we name that were accepted as fact that then later had to be changed when it was found contrary to those facts. So, again, it's not foolproof. It's not foolproof at all. And so we look at this, and we can start to see that every contingent being, that's you or I, the animal kingdom, whatever, has a design of like causes having like effects. And such designs, you and I, the animal kingdom, whatever it is, cannot explain their own existence. So we look at that, and again, we see, okay, there must be a first cause or a necessary being that does not need a designer himself. And you see, we can hold that as a universal principle. And when we do that, we have another proof of God's existence. So that's very important, that cause and effect. And, even if now you believe in evolution, and I want to point this out, that, that does not, and this is where there's a lot of misconception, and people ran with this during Darwin's time, and there were a lot of reasons for that. But, people use that real quickly because, they could point to this and say, okay, well, there's no God, so, this is the best we can do here. Trust in us, trust in our systems, trust in the people. And you can see that there is a power transfer here, that now if there's no God, then we're only accountable to each other. And in cases that got extreme, then we're only accountable to people who may be feeling they're better than us, the so-called elites, and that they know what's best. And you start going down these slopes, and we've seen them now right up to our own day, that can be very, very devastating consequences for mankind. So the point here is that let's say you believe in evolution, that it does not replace God or the designer, if you wish, because we are still the secondary causes. And even if there was natural selection, as we mentioned, there is, an evolution comes from this natural selection and survival of the fittest, then what we see here is that you still need that mechanism. You still need that design, that purpose that was, you look at the designer that proposed this to have a purpose of all this, in this case, natural selection. So it's still a secondary cause, which doesn't replace the first cause. As a matter of fact, if you want to look at it that way, then you can see that you need a design. If you believe in evolution, then it might be interesting to look at the concept that it doesn't actually leave the designer or the first cause with nothing to do. Rather, actually, he'd have more to do than ever, because everything being contingent, because we're secondary causes now, is dependent on the designer to get these. We talked about the proof of existence through motion last week, to get these things moving, to get this cause and effect, to have this like cause, like effect in our universe. So there is no competition, if you want to look at it that way, between the designer and evolution or natural selection. So, this is something you might want to just examine when you're looking at things like this. And, we look and you see that we look at God, and we look and we have these concepts that come in our thoughts. And whether are abstract, we can look at something like snow is white, and we can see that this is a term that we can apply to things that are white in colors, to things like that. Example, snow. And we look at this, no matter what language we use. We have this word for snow, we have this word for white, and we know that it is. So even when we see these concepts, where did these concepts come? Where did our thoughts come? Where do these things originate that are worldwide, that are universal, that concepts are universal, like snow is white, and we see this, and the sky being blue here when we look. And we can acknowledge that no matter what side of the globe we're on, what language we use. And these are, we can think they're merely our thoughts, and they come from us, but let's look at it this way. If we weren't even created, it still wouldn't change the fact, long before our intellect, long before our reason, long before our concepts or anything that we could come up with, snow would still be white. Why? Because of a creator, the first cause, the necessary being. So we see then that this is where these concepts originate. They come from some cause, some necessary being that knows all truth, all the possibilities of truth, all the truths that have been and all the truths that will come. And he knows this. And again, we look at this and we look at a cause or a designer. And that these concepts come not from within our own thoughts because we like them or we're, God ourselves that we create them, but they come from outside. From outside. Very much part of us. And we know these concepts because they're universal across the globe in whatever language a particular people speak or nation they live. Or, again, section of the globe that they live, we can see these things, and we can agree upon these things. So, again, these universal concepts, all point to something outside of you and myself and everything created as contingent beings, because we're contingent upon this first cause, who, we're calling God on this show, proof of his existence. Now, I think, many scientists that believe in God have and pointed out, and philosophers and many, people with a strong faith, they can use their reason, they can use the scientific findings, and they can point and say, okay, this is God. And yet, so the proofs, especially the deeper, as we just mentioned a moment ago, the deeper we go, the more we look at some concepts, the more we meditate on this, the more we can see that need for designer. And it's exciting, because even like quantum mechanics, which, some people now, one of the things, just backtrack here a little bit, now one of the arguments, because again, some will just go kicking and screaming into the night that there's not any first cause, there's no God, that matter always was, matter can create itself. They're trying to change, the laws that's been held, scientific laws, for such a long time. They're trying to change them here midstream to fit their personal taste. And things kind of get, really a kind of a crazy argument after a period of time. And just, some of the argument now you hear some say is that, well, it just is. And that really doesn't quite cut it. Because we're again talking about using faith and reason and an intellect that God gave us to use this reason, and that they don't have to be contradictory, And when we start hearing stuff like this, is you're really grasping at things when you say, well, it's just always this way. Matter always existed to create itself, because even when you look at that, matter again has to have the creator. Matter, again, when we said like causes and like effect, there has to be a design for this matter. And even with quantum mechanics, and what they're finding, you see, even these are based on laws. And where did they come from? They didn't just pop up. Remember I mentioned last week that there's that new pop-up philosophy. Things just, poof, came into existence. A rabbit out of the hat type thing. So, but we know better than that, or we should. So we look at this, and if we're honest with ourselves, we can see these proofs. And again, we look at this, the limitations of science being in the material world, looking at how things work in the material world, not necessarily a supernatural world, of course, that they can't disprove or prove God from a scientific standpoint. It's beyond their realm. And then when we look at this, and we've, made some points on why we believe that there's a creator, and we can use our faith and logic for all this. Some people would argue, well, then why don't some people accept God? Well, you always have this free will. And I believe today, that, even if Jesus appeared, before the second coming now, before Judgment Day, just to give us a heads up, that people would not believe. That it would be, they would say, well, it's some kind of deception. Maybe, another country put some kind of hologram across the sky. Who knows? But you know what I'm getting at. There'd always be people, even when the truth is right in front of them, that you would not see this. So, they would not come to believe. You're always going to get that, And I think the other thing that, people have a problem with is the old, why would a good God have all this evil? And I think what many times we miss is especially that when you look at that and people are so quick, why did God let this happen? And why God didn't prevent this? And, we answer these questions, and they are tough questions. And the question of suffering, the question of death and war and so much misery, especially the times we're living now. There's so much tension, so much fear, and why does it have to be this way? So you see, just the fact that we know that it shouldn't be, that should be cause for us to pause and say, well, why? What do we know deep inside of us that it isn't quite right? And that'll get us to start to meditate and ponder on some things. Like, now, when we say, why is God responsible for all this, we're missing some things. We talk about the supernatural aspect on this show. And if you've been a follower, if you're not, I absolutely believe, and not the only one, the Catholic Church, certainly believes this, that, there's a battle. It's a supernatural battle based, God versus Satan, and good versus evil, and the good guys versus the bad guys. It's true. It's an absolute truth. It's an absolute truth that there is life after this and where we will spend it. And we don't, how many times is it, well, Satan did this or that or evil did this. You don't hear that a lot. And yet that is part of it. There is influence by demons. There's no question that they tempt us. And that we, weaken from original sin, and sinners are drawn to that darkness, drawn to what St. Augustine called concupiscence, drawn to the dark. We're drawn to the dark. We have that curious that gets us into a world of trouble, literally. And we don't look at that enough. We're going to do a show on, spiritual attacks and how this Satan and the demons work to attack us, and then we don't even see it. So that's a supernatural aspect of our lives, and we need to look at that. There is an influence on our lives, and it's not a good one. It's out for our destruction. And everything that God created in this universe, by the way, not just human beings, everything. The devil is pure hatred. There's evil, pure evil. And we'll look at that. The other thing we don't look at is that, what about our choices? Now, whether it's myself, the listeners of the show, people we've all done stuff that we're not proud of, that we knew we should not do, and yet we went and did them. And we hurt people. Not only did we hurt people, we hurt, of course, ourselves, but the biggest thing, and this is, way back in the garden, original sin, the sin separated us from God. And our sins do that. So we have this separation from God. And when we sin and have this separation, good things are not going to happen. And those are our choices. We can't blame God. If we're going out there and we're fooling around outside of the context of marriage, and bad things are going to start happening, we get some kind of disease, and worse, say we were committing adultery and we brought that home to our wife, well, there are consequences for that. And you cannot blame God. Well, God, you know how much I enjoy this. Why didn't you stop this from happening? Wow, look at that reasoning. We're taking the responsibility right off on our sinful nature, and we're going to blame God and ask him, well, geez, God, I'm going to do all this crazy stuff, but can you please not let these things happen, the consequences of my actions? So we have that. So we have the supernatural aspect, the demonic, and these temptations. And then we have our free will to either do good. We can do good. Remember, we have the condition by our choices to do God's will in our lives, and good things will happen. Or the opposite. and bad things may happen to us, and we can't blame God for that. And the third thing is to look at and see that when we argue this, that God could have done better. If I was God, I wouldn't have this or this. That's a big responsibility. Be glad you're not God. But where does the good come out of this? Where is all the good we see in the world? The soldier that throws his body on a hand grenade to save his troops. Those people that worked during the COVID, the healthcare workers, and some perished, trying to save other people, putting their lives and their families at risk to serve. And all the good things we do, whether, we see somebody broken down on the road with a flat tire and we go to help them, or somebody down on their luck and you give them some money or some food. It goes on and on and on and on and on. And I'm sure you've done some of this in your own lives, believers or not, that you've helped people out. So there's a good here that we fail to see. And also, here's something I'd like you to look at. At the source of all this goodness, there's only one that could get out of all the evil in the world and bad things happening to us in our individual lives. Only God could get good out of this. Now, how do we know this? Well, first of all, we can see in our own lives many times what we thought at one moment was bad. Now, I'll give you a quick example from the environment, since we're talking, with science and stuff like that on the show. That something was bad actually got good. And this is just a quick example, that in the 70s, I don't know if you remember, for those who've been around, dating myself here, they had out west, a big eradication program to go against coyotes, and a huge bounty. And it was because the people, the ranchers, were complaining that, the sheep their stock were being killed by the coyotes, things were damaged, they were losing their livelihood. So the government decided that they would have this eradication. There was a war against coyotes. I'm not going to get into the ways they did it, because some guys, they went out there, and it wasn't just enough to kill them and bring back a pelt for a bounty. Let's just put it this way, some of the things they did were barbaric, to watch these poor things suffer in death. Not bad enough to just kill them. Anyway, off that. So many, many coyotes were killed. Many, 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 many. And here's what happened. So this was like a bad thing. The ranchers are losing their livelihood. Where do we go from there if we lose those guys and lose the sheep and lose, crops, and the government's got to intervene, and this is a disaster, so let's do this. And it seemed bad that these predators, these coyotes, would be doing this, so we're going to fix it. And what it turned out was that it got worse, because they took this apex predator, the coyote, out of the equation, and God, here again, we see this regularity in nature, which we talk about on today's show, and something started to happen, because now rodents started to invade the ranchers, and insects came along with it, and crops were getting more damaged, and livestock, now you would have diseases, and they were doing, they could do much more harm than, say, a few sheep being killed by a predator. And what happened is the farmers then came and said, this is worse than ever. We're taking a bigger hit. You see, as crazy it was, they were basically losing 35 sheep to these predators. And that's just not on coyotes. I believe that was also bear and mountain lions, things like that. So anyway, the cause here, and what they've hoped, was that they would get involved and they would affect a good cause. And it backfired on them dramatically in two ways. One, that the damage now was much worse financially, much worse. And the government spent billions on this to get rid of these coyotes, and it was worse. And the farmers took a huge hit financially, much more than when they had the apex predator. And two, and you got to give the coyotes credit, and this was a good thing, because this is what I mean about good coming out of bad. The coyotes actually survived despite incredible amounts of numbers being taken out, and actually tripled in numbers. And that was a good thing, because when things were relaxed by the government, the coyotes came back and restored the natural order. And the government came up with a plan and actually said, after spending all these billions, why don't we just pay the farmers, the ranchers, for their damage their sheep. And again, 35 a year on the average, and they're damaged to any crops or anything like that. So it was cheaper, and things had restored the natural balance. So what appeared bad actually had a good outcome in it, because things, we learned from that. And the biggest thing to look at that and see that we know, how do we know that this can work for good and only God can get it? Because the worst thing mankind has done, and we've done some things, haven't we? Was we killed God on a Good Friday. So in essence, we could hurry up and go worship him. And we tortured him, and we crucified him. So the worst thing human beings ever did actually turned into the best. Because Jesus, rising from the dead 3 days later, opened the gates of heaven and overcame death and won for us our eternal salvation. The best thing that ever happened to us. So out of the worst thing mankind did, the best thing happened. And only God can do that. And I'll bet you, brothers and sisters, even in your own lives, that at a time when things seem so bad, and that you would never survive this, and all your fears seem to be coming true, that you did. And that when you look back, that bad thing might have been the best thing that ever happened to you. We hear stories about this all the time, from prisoners, from people that got sick, from people that had just incredible hardship, broken relationships. The amount of sometimes how good can come. And I'm not trying to say suffering is easy or to downplay it at all, because it's a tough road. It's a tough walk, and Christ knew that walk. That's why he said, pick up his cross and follow me daily. And that's what we have to do. It's the same thing. At that time, crucifixion was considered such a horrible way to go and such a curse. It would be the same thing if we would say, well, you know what? Let's pick up our electric chair and let's carry that around and follow him daily, because that's how brutal crucifixion was. But God came through for us big time. So that's how we know. So that's just something I'd like you to ponder and think about some of these things we talked about the last two shows, and not have to have this division where it's got to be either science or God, faith or reason. But it can be both. It can be science and God, and faith and reason. And that's how we begin, with our intellect and our heart, to walk closer and closer to our Lord and look at the handiwork in his creation, and to love it and to appreciate it and to pray. Pray for people who don't believe. Pray for scientists that don't believe, because they do wonderful things, and many want to help badly. And pray for them. Pray for them, always. And when we get to this type of unity, good things are going to happen. Good things are going to happen. We're going to have a lot of ethical things done. And maybe some of the diseases that haunt us now, some of these pandemics, some of the things that are so devastating to us, with a faith-based belief that we can find ethical cures for these things. And it's a win-win for everybody. And we walk closer and closer to our Lord as he fills us with his blessings. So with that, I thank you for listening. I wish you a good night, and God bless.
Thank you for listening to a production of WCAT Radio. Please join us in our mission of evangelization. And don't forget, love lifts up when knowledge takes flight.